So welcome to everyone who's joined us, and welcome to this webinar entitled Cybersecurity, Digital Trade and Development. It's organised by the International Institute for Sustainable Development, where I work, and funded generously by SIDA, the Swedish International Development Agency. So we're grateful for their support. This session is focused very much on cybersecurity in the context of digital trade, and it's designed to give you all an understanding of the policy landscape, specifically from a development perspective. And as more economic activity and trade gradually becomes digitized, the risks that it faces are changing, of course. There's questions of risks of access to personal data, access to business data, and even control of infrastructure and physical facilities. So as the very nature of our economic activity is changing and the nature of our trade is changing, the risks and the policy frameworks around it are going to change as well. And we have this afternoon a really interesting lineup of speakers to help us understand these various emerging risks and how governments are addressing them. We'll start with Neha Mishra, who's an associate professor at the Geneva Graduate Institute and the author of a forthcoming policy brief, which I have reviewed and is extremely good, helping us to set out or helping us to understand this question of cybersecurity in the context of digital trade. So she's going to present some of the key findings of the research that she's been doing. And then we'll have perspectives from actors in the international trade policy space and perspectives on some of these issues. I'll turn the floor after Neha to Cecilia Risolo, who is Minister Counselor at the Permanent Mission of Argentina to the World Trade Organization. So thank you for joining us, Cecilia. And then to Laura Siren, who's an Economic Affairs Officer at UN Trade and Development, and who's done a lot of work on cybersecurity and its relationship to digital trade. It's my great pleasure to give Neha the floor first. Essentially, what we've asked her to do is to walk us through the policy brief she's preparing to help us understand why cybersecurity issues are gaining importance in today's trade landscape, what kinds of cybersecurity measures governments are looking at and implementing, and how they are looking or how they are trying through regional trade agreements and potentially at the WTO as well, to bring some coordination to these various measures they're taking to address cybersecurity. So without further ado, Neha, I'm delighted to give you the floor first. Go ahead, please.
Thank you very much, Alice, and also big thanks to IIST for organizing this event, and hello to everyone. And I'm really delighted to join all of you today. So I think Alice has already mentioned what I'm going to do. So I'll just start right away. So if you can turn to the first slide, the next slide, please. So the first point is just to understand a little bit about cybersecurity, what it is. And while we have often understood cybersecurity from a technological or a technical perspective, and typically engineers refer to the CIA triad, which is the confidentiality, integrity, and authenticity of data and the networks that carry the data. Today, cybersecurity really has a much broader meaning, and the policy brief actually walks through different ideas that are being closely interwoven with cybersecurity, notions of economic security, political security, military security, and even in certain cases, socio-cultural security are forming a part of the broader cybersecurity regulatory framework. I'll briefly tell you some examples as well. But before we do that, it's important to understand the trade nexus. Why is it that trade bodies are so interested in cybersecurity protection? Because it doesn't seem like a very intuitive connection. You would think it's something very technical. Why would a trade body be interested? And the biggest explanation is the growth of the digital economy. The fact that we have such a huge digital economy means that there is the need for data to continuously flow across different jurisdictions, across different borders, and they need to be secure and remain open at the same time. And cybersecurity is often at the very fundamental core of these data flows. And that's one of the key reasons why it has entered the trade narrative so quickly. From a public policy perspective, cybersecurity is also seen as a global policy good, a global public good, which is why that is something that also being discussed in different contexts, especially more recently in free trade agreements and digital economy agreements as to how to achieve greater cooperation on many of these issues. And finally, there's the economic perspective as well, where we are seeing a world where there are more cyber threats, more cyber incidents. They cause huge economic losses, disruptions, and that's again another reason why trade bodies and trade policymakers are so interested in cybersecurity. Now, because there's a development focus to our discussion, I wanted to also discuss upfront what is so specific about the challenges that developing countries face in this area. So, the first one is just domestic regulatory expertise and capacity. It is not the same as bigger developed economies who have massive resources at hand to manage complex cybersecurity problems. Most developing countries face severe challenges of not just funding but also having the right expertise available locally. Many countries also do not have relevant laws or regulations, or if they have them, they are implemented in a weak way or perhaps not even in a very consistent way. Many developing countries also do not really find such a strong voice in different international organizations or standard development bodies or even multi-stakeholder internet bodies where issues of cybersecurity are developed. If you look at the cybersecurity environment, often the weakest links in the global supply chain are developing countries because the cybersecurity environment in those countries is not as robust. And that can also be a big challenge that many developing countries face. Um, a lot of private actors also have limited interest in engaging, particularly with smaller developing economies and LDCs, because there isn't a big market to be explored in those markets. So they do not also get that kind of support from the private sector, unlike many developed jurisdictions where we see a lot of public private collaboration in cybersecurity. And finally, there might not be enough local talent. So there may not be enough engineers and experts in cybersecurity within the country. And that can be a huge challenge as well. So that's the reason why developing countries face their unique challenges on top of course, all the transnational challenges that exist for all countries across the world. The next slide, please. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about, what these different kinds of cybersecurity measures are. But beyond that, also understanding who is implementing what or dealing with what aspects of cybersecurity governance, what are they doing and why are they doing it? So usually when we think about cybersecurity measures, especially in the trade context, we only focus on what states are doing. But actually, the field of cybersecurity governance is really broad. So, in addition to states, you have to think about what private companies are doing, what standard development organizations are doing. There are different international organizations who are now very much involved in different aspects of cybersecurity governance. Um, I've also mentioned civil society, multi-stakeholder internet bodies, and hackers with a question mark, because there are debates as to the extent to which they form a part of the formal regulatory environment, but they do have a very important role to play as well. Um, what are these players doing? Now, states typically implement laws and regulations. Private companies, standard development organizations often are behind a lot of technical standards that you see that are adopted in the industry. They might, alongside in multi-stakeholder internet bodies, they might also be designing different protocols. Um, International organizations and states are both developing all kinds of soft law. There are also different kinds of informal arrangements, not just between states, but also between private sector and regulatory bodies, as well as between different private bodies. So it's a really vast regulatory space to sum it up. And again, the rationale that different organizations who or different stakeholders who are involved in this have can also really vary. So, for instance, a lot of technical bodies, particularly standard development bodies, are quite concerned about cybersecurity protection and data security. And so are states, of course, who are implementing laws and regulations. But then there can be very unique concerns that states have, such as access to data, or they might want to have more control over foreign tech companies. And they often use cybersecurity measure as one of the tools that they can use. A lot of private sector bodies and private standard development organizations are also concerned about interoperability, and that's also a big factor that plays into this entire governance framework. Now, what kind of cybersecurity measures do states impose? There are all kinds of measures, some of which you might expect, some of which are less expected. Um, So the common ones that we hear about are data restrictions and controls, which form part of the cybersecurity regime. It could be a specific cybersecurity law. It could be spread across different laws and regulations. And often the intention behind it is to protect data or to protect cybersecurity of networks. Um, Increasingly, governments also implement a lot of organizational and different kinds of compliance requirements. So, if you are a private company, you have to do X, Y, Z for ensuring robust cybersecurity compliance. There are also other frameworks around technical standards or certification of digital products and different kinds of apps and services that we have. So again, the number of measures that we see can be quite varied. Some of them may not be called cybersecurity measures, but the impact they have is really, or one of the biggest rationales behind it is cybersecurity protection. And it's also worth noting that when we look at cybersecurity regulation, it could be state centric, but also there could be other models. There could be multi stakeholder models where private and public sector might work with each other alongside other bodies, particularly technical bodies, or it could be market oriented. So that, and many countries adopt a mixture of these approaches. So it's worth remembering this big picture about cybersecurity governance. The next slide, please. Now, because we are very interested in digital trade, and when you once you enter the trade domain, you start thinking often in terms of economics. So, I wanted to highlight a little bit about what the potential trade impact of cybersecurity measures could be. However, it is important to remember at the same time that this, irrespective of what the economic impact might be on digital trade flows, a lot of cybersecurity measures have genuine, legitimate public policy rationales behind them. So often, when countries impose these different restrictive measures, they are really trying to balance different policy priorities. So it is not necessarily always a tool to safeguard domestic markets from foreign competition or to limit market access to foreign companies. It could be a variety of reasons, and the balancing exercise can go in different directions. There's a very good study. If someone is interested, I think it was published at the Harvard Business Review, and they looked at the trade impact of different kinds of cybersecurity measures, and they found that it was a spectrum from having absolutely no impact on businesses to the other extreme of completely decoupling markets. So you can think of some of the aggressive measures where we have seen countries trying to create these networks which are free of digital products and services from a particular country. That could be complete market decoupling, especially if two big powers like US and China are involved. But what we see often in practice is somewhere in between. They could have some amount of impact on market access, or in some situations they might not really impact market access, but there might be some requirements to be able to access the market. Now, some typical examples to understand this trade impact, and I've put a few of them on the slide. So, data localization is often discussed extensively, and it's quite common in many cybersecurity related frameworks. Sometimes it may not necessarily be a hard localization requirement, but there could be certain controls or approval requirements on cross border data transfers. Now, usually this is often seen as being economically harmful, also often technologically inefficient. But as I discuss in my policy brief in more detail, often there can be a rationale behind it, particularly when you consider certain foreign networks or foreign companies to not treat your data as securely as you would like to for your own citizens. There are also some other measures which are not obvious examples, but which actually have a very strong rationale and connection with cybersecurity. So, for instance, a lot of governments are now demanding access to a variety of technical information, including source code and algorithms. And this is often a pre-requirement for market access. If you want to supply this product in our market, you have to provide all this technical information. And the idea behind it could be a lot of things. It could be about accessing data, it could be controlling foreign tech companies, but it could also be auditing algorithms or ensuring that law enforcement authorities have access to enough information if they need to get access to it. So again, the balancing exercise can be quite difficult. There's some other examples I've mentioned. So for instance, mandatory technical standards could be imposed by a government, which are often domestic standards. They may not be global best practices, which means that they might favor certain domestic companies who have developed those standards, but might be more cumbersome for foreign companies who may be following the best practices. And it's worth thinking if that, again, creates benefits for the digital economy, but also security risks, because those standards may not be as robust as the global best practices. Other examples that, and I can discuss them later in the question and answers, but governments, especially in recent cybersecurity related policies and laws and regulations, they have been coming up with very complex licensing or certification, auditing, and testing mechanisms. And on the surface of it, while they may not necessarily look like they impact trade, it really depends on how they are implemented. Sometimes they can, for instance, if testing has to be done in specific national laboratories, it can be quite expensive. Similarly, if the certification mechanism is very complex, it might really impact particularly small and medium-sized businesses because they may not have the resources to comply with all those requirements. The next slide, please. Now I wanted to talk a little bit about trade agreements. So now we have a little bit of the overview, the landscape, that cybersecurity is important for digital trade, and also that governments are implementing different kinds of measures that impact or that are related to cybersecurity that impact digital trade flows. So do trade agreements really address these issues? Perhaps you may not be surprised that there's no specific provision on cybersecurity in WTO law. It was written, those rules were written at a time where we were not thinking about these concerns specifically. However, in my assessment, at least to the extent the provisions exist in different WTO treaties, they can still apply in the context of different cybersecurity related measures, whether they are data restrictions, whether it's related to imposition of technical standards, or whether they are very complex licensing or other kinds of approval mechanisms. But and there could be potential breaches for that reason. So for instance, if you, let's say, and this is an extreme example, but if you ban a particular technology or a digital service because you think it is not secure enough and you think it doesn't meet the cybersecurity standards, then it is a straightforward violation of market access. Of course, you have to look at specific rules in the WTO treaty, including the schedules, if you're particularly looking at the GATS agreement. But it's worth remembering here that while these breaches might happen in practice, in reality, applying WTO law it becomes quite complicated because you also have to look at the exceptions. And for those of you who are familiar with WTO law, you have the general exceptions and the security exceptions. And none of them were designed thinking about the day-to-day cybersecurity risks that we are facing. So especially the security exceptions were more designed thinking about wars and different kinds of international crisis, and as a result of which the application of those exceptions leads to very difficult and sensitive political questions which are very hard to manage, particularly in a trade body. Other than that, things have been happening at the WTO. So for instance, the TBT committee, which is deals with technical standards in trade and goods, has been discussing different kinds of cyber security measures. Different members have brought up concerns, particularly about Chinese, Vietnamese, and EU initiatives, different regulatory instruments on cybersecurity. And under the JSI, the plurilateral agreement on e-commerce, there is a provision on cybersecurity which has been proposed, but we don't know again how far it will go. It's not particularly very strong, but it's worth remembering that there is some dialogue on that. On the other hand, in free trade agreements or preferential trade agreements and digital economy agreements, which are a new generation of agreements dealing only with digital trade issues, there is a lot more going on on cybersecurity because they have dedicated chapters on digital trade and e-commerce. Now, very broadly speaking, the language in these provisions is quite aspirational, high level, soft language. And most of it is centered around cooperation, building more cooperation among countries, finding more consensus, helping in some kind of capacity, not necessarily capacity building, but between the different regulators, finding ways of coordinating among different regulators. But when it comes to very specific developing country concerns, how to offer them technical assistance, capacity building, usually there is no language. The only exception is the AFCFTA digital trade protocol. Nothing else really contains anything of substantial value. One other shift has been that recent years have seen in many FTAs, particularly where Singapore has been a party, where they have tried to shift towards recognizing the need for multi-stakeholder approaches. There's more recognition of risk-based approaches and also adopting common consensus-based standards. One last point on these FTAs, the security exceptions are also kind of evolving. And I think you might have heard this also in a broader context, that countries now perceive national security issues very differently in a world which is geopolitically very complex. And this has also kind of affected how countries have framed security related issues in the context of cyber security. There are a few treaties which now have cyber specific language, or at least provisions which can be read quite specifically in the cyber context. And another big shift in many FTAs is that the language in security exceptions is completely self-judging. While in the WTO law, the test requires actually, to demonstrate some kind of causal connection and good faith application of the exception. I think there's one more slide. Yes. And I wanted to end with this, which is basically trying to then kind of put put forth a domestic and the international level perspective on how developing countries can what kind of policy making is necessary to involve more developing countries and to also support them in building a more robust cybersecurity environment which can help them participate more meaningfully in the digital economy. So at the domestic level, of course, it's important to have context-specific domestic laws and regulations. We have seen that there, especially when countries receive some kind of funding or support from big digital powers, they are often forced to adopt a similar regulatory model. But this should not be the case. It should be an evidence-based approach, and it should be contextualized to the political and economic and social environment within the country. It's also important, and many of you might know that a lot of developing countries now have a cybersecurity strategy, but it's important to integrate into the digital innovation strategy. It's not a siloed approach does not really work very well. And finally, I think this is something, of course, which is quite difficult, and especially for LDCs, but building domestic talent, infrastructure, and capabilities, it's very important, and particularly finding ways to partner with the private sector. And I know some international organizations have been trying to push for more initiatives and in that direction. At the international level, and this could also be partly also at the regional level, technical assistance and capacity building measures are really important. And this is something that should find more space in trade agreements. It's quite unfortunate that at the JSI, these measures were not really included in the draft. And that's something that is really relevant for developing countries. It's also not a moral obligation, in my view, because it helps in building the digital economy. It's also important to create very clear exceptions in the cyber context. This is increasingly being seen as being very important. From the international level, in terms of looking at cybersecurity standards, there's some dialogue at the World Trade Organizations, how you look at particularly standards which don't come traditionally from multilateral bodies, but from private bodies or multi-stakeholder bodies. The position is not so clear in law, and that creates regulatory and legal uncertainty and also business uncertainty. There are some other ideas I propose within the trade context, like looking at widespread use of mutual recognition agreements. We usually hear this only amongst very powerful countries like the EU and US working on this, but perhaps doing this on a broader basis is important. And finally, in addition to all that is happening in the trade world, it's important to think of cybersecurity cooperation in other fora as well, and for different organizations that work on relevant aspects to come together. I'll end my presentation here. Thank you.
Neha, that was fantastic, really interesting and beautifully structured. So thank you very much for taking us through all of that. We're now over 80 people in this webinar, which is wonderful. Thank you all for joining us if I missed you at the beginning. And a reminder, you can add your questions to the speakers in the Q&A box, which is under the circle with the 3 dots in it as we go along. Cecilia, I might turn to you next. Could you perhaps give us a policymaker's perspective on some of these questions? Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Alice. Good afternoon to everyone, and thank you, Neha, for this very interesting presentation. I would like to thank IISD for the opportunity to contribute to this important conversation, sharing my thoughts as a policymaker. I will My intervention will briefly address the key messages of the policy brief, trying not to overlap with Niha's presentation, touch on WTO discussions on trade and cybersecurity, and share some reflections based on Argentina's experience. The policy brief we are discussing today highlights the growing intersection between trade and cybersecurity, an area that is becoming increasingly complex and critical. As digitalization accelerates and cross-border data flows expand, cybersecurity is now both a foundation for digital trade, but also a source of regulatory tension. As Niha mentioned, there are a few key trends that stand out from the policy paper. First is domestic cybersecurity regulations are proliferating. Also, the WTO rules currently lack specific provisions on cybersecurity, as Niha very clearly explained. And perhaps most importantly, the development dimension of cybersecurity remains under address. Many developing countries lack the technical capacity, infrastructure, and human resources to meet modern cybersecurity demands. Going forward, as Neha mentioned, the paper proposes we must move beyond the trade versus security narrative. What we need are policies that promote both. This means adopting risk-based approaches, ensuring compatibility with international standards, avoiding duplicative requirements, and including clear commitments on capacity building in digital trade agreements. Cybersecurity should be also part of a broader digital development strategies, not handled in isolation, as Neha mentioned. So I will also briefly add some details about what is happening at the WTO. As you know, discussions are happening in regular bodies like the TBT Committee and the Council for Trade in Goods, where members are raising concerns about the trade impacts of national cybersecurity regulations. These concerns are mainly related to consistency of these measures with WTO rules in regards to transparency, implementation, businesses' ability to comply with cybersecurity regulations, and the importance of using international standards to avoid market fragmentation. That is something that for the members is always a huge concern regarding, especially new rules. And related to this point, and to add a little bit more information, I would like to invite the participants in this webinar to take a look at the thematic session on that the TBT committee organized in 2023 on this topic that is available on the WTO website, and I think that it resonates with today's discussion. And finally, I would like to briefly refer to Argentina's experience. Argentina adopts a multi-agency approach to cybersecurity. Our policies and strategies are developed with the involvement of various ministries and government bodies. Argentina firmly upholds the principle that the peaceful use of cyberspace. And in multilateral forums, particularly at the United Nations, where there's a wide discussion on this topic, we advocate for dialogue and cooperation as key pillars to ensure an open, secure, interoperable, and peaceful cyberspace. At the national level, in January of this year, Argentina approved a 2-year plan that recognizes cyberspace as essential to economic and social development, but also highlights the growing threats posed by cybercrime. The plan also recognizes the global efforts made by governments, companies, and international organizations to strengthen cybersecurity through the development and the updating of regulatory frameworks, by fostering international cooperation, and by promoting public-private collaboration to create a safer cyberspace. Our plan also emphasized that education and awareness play a crucial role in improving cybersecurity, and these efforts require the joint work of government, private sector, and the civil society. Another important element in the plan is the need to respect individual rights and freedoms. I mean, many of the aspects addressed in Argentina's plans, I believe, align with the key points highlighted in the policy paper that we are addressing today, such as the need to strengthen human resources and technological tools to update and adapt current regulations, and to increase international cooperation. So if I may, by connecting the initial points I mentioned regarding the policy paper with Argentina's cybersecurity strategy and pillars, I believe it is essential to delve deeper into the development of national regulatory frameworks. These frameworks must be adapted to the realities, needs, and policy objectives of each country, also as Neha mentioned, while also ensuring the alignment with the minimum standards adopted by the international community, because this is the real key to facilitate trade from now to the future also. So, and likewise, I recognize the importance of strengthening human resources and local capabilities in order to respond effectively to the new and constantly evolving challenges, as well as the ongoing need to reinforce international cooperation. And with regard to regulations and its connection to international trade, although Argentina currently does not have a trade agreement that includes cybersecurity as a formal component, from a personal perspective, I believe it is important to monitor and pay attention to developments in this area, because often regional trade agreements act as sort of laboratories where new rules are tested on emerging issues. And eventually are these rules that feed into multilateral negotiations, such as those at the WTO. One thing that happened when we were negotiating the GSI on e-commerce. So in closing, as we navigate this new digital trade landscape, I believe this policy paper presents a compelling and timely call for coherence, cooperation, and inclusion. And I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Cecilia, thank you very much. That was really interesting. It was interesting to hear the concerns that get raised at the WTO, and I've taken good note that there is the recording of the thematic session available on the WTO's website, so we can see for ourselves how these discussions happen, which doesn't always happen at the WTO, so it's wonderful to see that. And your point about the need for regulatory frameworks to be developed that really speak to the national realities and sets of priorities while remaining aligned to minimum international standards was, I think, a useful way of characterizing the policy challenge that we need to build. So thank you, that's really useful, and useful also to hear about how Argentina approached the development of its own national strategy and the range of stakeholders involved in that. So again, it's as if you had read Neha's policy paper beforehand. I might turn perhaps next to you, Laura, because UN Trade and Development works very closely with a number of developing countries in this area. So I wondered if you could share your perspective from your professional work with developing countries in navigating some of these issues. Go ahead, please.
Thank you very much. And well, thank you very much also to IISD to invite UNCTAD to participate in this discussion today, and as well to have been involved in the peer review of Neha's very interesting policy brief, which, well, is a very excellent and timely discussion of the policy landscape in this area on cybersecurity and trade. What I will do very briefly is also to highlight sort of in the context of Neha's policy brief parts, which I believe that align quite well with our work and experience, basically, and try to very briefly add a bit of additional points to that discussion. So as Neha pointed out at the beginning also of her presentation, of course, so digitalization is making an important change and difference to to trade, and making trade basically universally digital to some extent. And what that of course implies is that then cybersecurity is a trade issue now, which we cannot ignore given how tightly connected global supply chains are these days. And that is an aspect that we are quite concerned and aware about at our work at UNCTAD, because what we see in collaborating with different countries is that cybersecurity remains one of the very big challenges that countries face at a national level, but then also once they sort of reach out towards more digital trade internationally, that building a sound enabling environment for e-commerce and digital trade is quite challenging, especially with also cybersecurity in mind. And what we've seen in our technical cooperation work, the so-called e-trade readiness assessments that my team has done in, I think, more than 38 countries now, is basically that cybersecurity very often emerges as one of those issues which is particularly siloed. So there's a specific agency maybe on cybersecurity, not in all countries, but in some countries, and they're aware that cybersecurity, of course, is an important issue for the country, but it's usually quite disconnected from trade policy to the state. So, of course, that is an issue given, as Neha pointed out quite correctly, that these things are increasingly more interwoven. And at the same time, we see, as Neha also pointed out, it's a question of the weakest link, right? Developing countries may lack the limited resources basically to build the proper cybersecurity environment and certain technical capacity. But at the same time, as the global trading system is very interconnected, once the weakest link doesn't have the proper cybersecurity, this can trigger down quite quickly and effectively. And just as because it was in the news a couple of days ago again, but the CrowdStrike IT outage last year, for example, wasn't a cybersecurity threat at least, but you saw how quickly it went through the entire planet in a very short period of time and showed how interconnected we are, so that this is a very important policy issue to discuss. So now I would like to sort of look at a couple of points that Neha addressed in her presentation and that will be addressed, I believe, in the policy brief, and sort of highlight a bit how they align quite well with our experience and work as well. So the first aspect would be of course, cybersecurity is an increasingly important global public good. And as has been mentioned by also Cecilia, there's an important need for national priorities to still feature importantly in cybersecurity at the national level, but at the same time, we need to acknowledge that these discussions need to take place on a more even playing field globally as well. And there we basically have seen in one of our reports, which the Digital Economy Report 2021, where Neha also contributed, basically that no country can secure its digital space in isolation these days. That's simply impossible. You are not disconnected from the world. So the system is only as strong as also our international agreements around these things are. And for that reason, of course, there are a lot of structural capacity gaps in countries that might be less well-resourced. And that has then certain issues and will lead to global risks overall. Then something that Neha pointed out and is very important to highlight, and we see a lot across our country work, is that, of course, these different regulatory approaches lead to a lot of fragmentation, or can lead to a lot of fragmentation, which is then particularly costly for developing countries, because, as Neha pointed out, if a certain country might either sponsor certain development in cybersecurity, but also mainly because it's your main trading partner, you need to align potentially to a country's cybersecurity framework, even though it might not necessarily align with national priorities. And that is an issue, of course, that is not ideal, because all countries should have a similar policy space to highlight their own development needs in a developing digital economy. And that is something that, if you are very interested in seeing how different potential sort of frameworks can look, we have a database where we try to collect these things, sort of the UNCTAD Cyber Law Tracker. You can see some of the different policy areas there. Then I think, as Neha correctly pointed out, cybersecurity is not necessarily or not equal to protectionism, but nevertheless, it's a case where this can be a disguised form of protectionism. And that's something that in our work, we also try to emphasize, that one should not use this tool to basically protect trade only because that's a sort of potential security measure that people can easily buy into. Cybersecurity remains a very valid concern. But it's at the same time, if you use too many of these measures, they, of course, undermine trust and the open digital economy, which has impacts on cross-border data flows, as pointed out before, and therefore mostly can imply that developing countries will be losing out if the data can't flow as freely as possible. And therefore, there's a very careful sort of balancing act in between these things, where you need to balance national security concerns, economic growth concerns, as well as development objectives, of course, in a sound manner. And something that in our work we are concerned about is, to some extent, the increasing complexity of trade negotiations in this context as well, because, as we've seen in a lot of things, so cybersecurity governance is still very fragmented even within countries, so across ministries and different agencies. But as more multilateral negotiations take place that include cybersecurity aspects, this implies that already stretched negotiation teams of some countries are even more stretched, because now they need to have additional cybersecurity awareness and capacity, basically. So that is something that the international community should really lean into and include into their international cooperation frameworks, that there's more training on these aspects, especially because it's an area which changes a lot, right? So from a development perspective, as in IT development, cybersecurity threats can evolve very quickly. Yeah, and I think that already brings me to the end. Thank you once again to inviting UNCTAD to this, and of course to this excellent policy brief.
A huge thank you to Niha, to Cecilia, and to Laura, and to the team within the ISD who put this together. I found it a really interesting overview of the policy brief, and from a policy perspective and a development aid perspective, the issues that we encounter as we help governments along this particular pathway, depending on where they wish to go.